Alright, I'm going to be talking about how to factor common monomials today. So remember, a factor is simply a number that is being multiplied by another number to equal a larger number. So for example, the factors of 8 would be 2, 2, and 2. The factors of 10 would be 2 and 5. The factors of 6 would be 2 and 3. So a factor is just a number that multiplies by another number to equal a larger number. So in this term, 2, 3, and x, all three of these are factors. 2 is a factor, 3 is a factor, and x is a factor because they're all being multiplied together. Now remember, the greatest common factor, or the GCF, is when I have two or more terms. The biggest factor that all of those terms have in common is the greatest common factor. So we could also think of it this way: it's the biggest number that can be divided by all of the terms I'm talking about. So for example, 8 and 10, the biggest factor they all have in common is 2. The biggest number they can be divided by is 2. For 8 and 12, they have two common prime factors. They have two 2's in common. So the biggest number they can divide by is 4. Their greatest common factor is 4. So there are 3 steps in finding the greatest common factor. First, I do prime factorization. Second, once I have my prime factorization, I circle all of the factors that are the same in both or all 3 or however many terms I have. Then I multiply those together. If they do not have any factors in common, then we say that is relatively prime. So for example, the numbers 8 and 15 are relatively prime, because 8 and 15 cannot be divided by the same number. The prime factors of 8 are 2, 2, and 2. The prime factors of 15 are 3 and 5. So they have no factors in common. So the only number they could both divide by would be 1. So we say that they are relatively prime. Now we can also use this for terms. So I'm showing you here how to do that with terms. If I have two terms, 108x cubed y, and then the term 72xy cubed z, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do prime factorization for my numbers. So there are 2 ways to find prime factors for the numbers. One is division by primes. I'm not going to go through that right now. Hopefully you remember how to do that from previous courses, but I have an example here on the board. The other is a factor tree, and I have an example on the board there as well. Then, with my variables, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write out all of my variables. So if my variable has an exponent, x cubed, that means x times x times x. So I'm going to write out x times x times x. If I have y cubed, that means y times y times y. So I write out y times y times y. Finally, so I'm going to write out on the bottom here for 108x cubed y. These are my variables, x, 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 y. And then these are my prime numbers that I got from my division by primes, 2, 2, 3, 3, 3. For 72x y cubed z, I have my variables, x, y, 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 z. And then for my numbers from my factor tree, my prime numbers are 2, 2, 2, 3, and 3. Now to find the greatest common factor, I'm going to circle the ones that are the same in both. So notice they both have a 3. They both have another 3. They both have a 2, and they both have another 2. They also both have one y, and they both have one x. Notice there was nothing else that they have in common. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write all of the numbers and letters that they have in common down below here. So I have 2, 2, 3, 3, x, y. So notice I'm writing 1 for each pair. So if they both have a 2, then I write 1, 2. Now I'm going to multiply. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 3 is 12. 12 times 3 is 36. And then I have 1x and 1y. So my greatest common factor is 36xy. Notice I can divide both of these by 36xy, and that's the biggest number I can divide both of those by. Now let's talk about how to factor when I have a binomial, how to factor out a monomial. So here, for example, let me get rid of some of this work here. Give you an example of a binomial. So my binomial that I'm going to factor is 8x squared minus 16. So I have 8x squared minus 16. So again, my first step is I'm going to find my greatest common factor of my two terms. So for 8x squared, I start off by I'll do division by primes to find my prime factors. So 8 is going to be 2, 2, 2, and then x squared is x and x. 16, I'll do the factor tree this time. So I have 4 2's. So now remember, I'm going to circle the ones that are the same. So they have 1, 2, 3 2's the same. Notice even though this one has 2 x's, this one doesn't have any x's, so I cannot circle the x. So I have 1, 2, 3 2's in common. I multiply those together, and I get my greatest common factor, which is 8. Now, once I have my greatest common factor, how do I factor that out of my binomial? What I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both of the terms in my binomial by my greatest common factor. So I'm going to divide this by 8 and this by 8. So what that's going to leave me with is 8 divided by 8 gives me 1x squared. Negative 16 divided by 8 is negative 2. So I divided both of these by 8. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my answer in parentheses, and then I'm going to put my greatest common factor outside the parentheses. So now I have factored, this is my final answer. I can check to see if I did it right by multiplying, and if I multiply using the distributive property, I should get the same answer that I started off with. 8 times x squared is 8x squared. 8 times negative 2 is negative 16, so I did that correctly. Let's look at another example of factoring. So my next example, I have 42a cubed. 42a cubed plus 14a. So again, I'm going to start off doing prime factorization of my numbers. So to save time, you should be able to know how to do that. I'm just going to write out the prime factors. So for 42, it is 2, 3, and 7. And for 14, it is 2 and 7. This is a cubed, so I'm going to write a. This is just a, so I'm just going to write 1a. Now I'm going to circle the ones that are the same in both. They both have a 2, they both have a 7, and they both have 1a. So I have 1, 2, 1, 7, and 1a. So my greatest common factor is 14a. So remember, my next step is to divide both of my original terms by my greatest common factor. So I'm going to divide this by 14a, and I'm going to divide this by 14a. So remember, when I divide, I'm going to divide my numbers. So 42 divided by 14 is 3. So that's going to be 3. A cubed, remember, if it doesn't have an exponent, the exponent is 1, I subtract and I get a squared. Plus, don't forget that plus sign. 14 cancels, a cancels. Remember, when everything cancels, that doesn't make 0, it makes 1. So I have to have a 1 there. Don't forget that 1. A lot of people forget about that. I'm going to put that in parentheses, and remember, outside the parentheses, I'm going to put my greatest common factor. And that's my answer. Remember, I could multiply back, and I should get my original number. Let me do another example here. So this time I have 3 terms instead of just 2 terms. So I have 36 x squared y plus 9xy cubed minus 27xy. So again, my first step is going to be to take all my numbers and do prime factorization. Again, I'm not going to do that because you should know how to do that, and I don't want to take the time. So for 36, I have 2, 2, 3, and 3. And then I have x squared, so that's 2 x's, and then just y. For 9, that's 3 and 3, x, and then 3y, since I have y cubed. For 27, that's 3, 3, and 3, 1x, and 1y. Now I have 3 terms, but I'm still doing the same thing. I'm going to circle the ones that are the same, but they have to be in all 3. It's not enough if they're just in 2 terms. They have to be in all 3 terms. So I have a 3 here, a 3 here, and a 3 here. So all 3 terms have 1 3. 3, 3, 3. All 3 terms have a second 3. All 3 terms have 1x. All 3 terms have 1y. There is no other thing that is in all 3. They have to be in all 3. Even if they're just in 2, you cannot use it. So I have 1 3 for each group of 3. I'm going to put 1, 1 3, 1x, and 1y. 3 times 3 is 9, so I have 9xy. That's my greatest common factor. Now remember, I'm going to divide my greatest common factor by all 3 of my terms. So I divide this by 9xy, divide this by 9xy, divide this by 9xy. 36 divided by 9 is 4. X squared divided by x is x. My y's cancel. 9's cancel, x's cancel, y cubed minus y is y squared. Don't forget that plus sign. Anytime I have a new term, you have to have a plus or a minus. Here I have a minus, so I'm going to put the minus here. 27 divided by 9 is 3. The x's cancel and the y's cancel. And then remember, put those in my answer in parentheses, and then my greatest common factor outside. And that is my answer. 9xy on the outside, 4x plus y squared minus 3 on the inside. Remember, if I multiply back, I should get my original problem. Let me do another example here. I have (51) x cubed plus 26y. So when I do my prime factorization for 51, I get 3 and 17, and then I have 3 x's. For 26, I get 2 and 13, and then I have 1y. Is there anything in common? There's nothing in common. So I don't have a greatest common factor. It's just 1. These are relatively prime. Guess what? If they're relatively prime, I can't factor anything. So this is my answer. That's all I have to do. I don't do anything. If there is no common factors, if there's not a greatest common factor, then I cannot factor anything, so I just leave it, and that is my answer. Now, sometimes you will have a greatest common factor that is actually a binomial. So let me give you, to finish off, one last example of how this would look. So I have x plus 1 plus 2 x plus 1. Notice that both of these terms, this is one term, because this is all being multiplied, and this is one term. Both of these terms have x plus 1. So since they both have x plus 1, I'm going to factor out that whole phrase, x plus 1. So in parentheses, I'm going to put x plus 1. And then what I have left, I have x plus 2 also in parentheses. Notice there is no sign between these because these are being multiplied. If I were to multiply this out, I would get the same as if I were to multiply that out. So my answer is x plus 1 times x plus 2. So since x plus 1 is both in parentheses, I pull that out. So I only have one of those. And then what's left is x plus 2. That's also in parentheses. So that would be how I would factor something that has a binomial.